Hello again, feral friends and fellow nature nerds, and thank you for tuning in to Dirt Dispatch number 51. I'm your host, Tim the Nature Nerd O'Hara. For this episode, I want to talk about a couple of things that I learned about just this last week that are sort of superficially related, I guess, to a certain degree, at least in name, if not in purpose. The first one I learned about from a social media post, and that was the turkey drive. To be fair, this is a topic more suited for Thanksgiving time rather than Easter, but I still want to tell you about it. Now, when I say turkey drive, I'm not talking about a community effort to collect frozen turkeys to give to families in need around the holidays. What I'm talking about is something akin to a cattle drive, but replace cattle with turkeys. You see, in the late 1700s and early 1800s, many New England farmers raised turkeys to be sold at market. And where was the nearest mass market? Well, that would have been Boston. Now, at the time, of course, they didn't have trains or trucks or refrigeration, so they didn't have the option of mass transportation, and slaughtering them first and then shipping them on ice wasn't an option either. So, if you were raising a few hundred turkeys in, say, Vermont, and you needed to get said turkeys to Boston, 300 miles away, to sell them, how did you do it? The answer is on foot. You walked your turkeys 300 miles to Boston. And I've heard some people complain about walking from the back of the parking lot at the grocery store. Now, just like a cattle drive, a turkey drive wasn't a one-man operation. Depending on the size of the flock, it may have required several dozen people to herd it, working together but with different responsibilities. Some worked as drovers, which, as the name suggests, meant they drove the turkeys, using a prod to urge them along. Sometimes they'd sprinkle feed on the ground to coax the birds forward. Occasionally, the drovers would tie a bell around the neck of a dominant turkey, which made the others more likely to follow it. Other workers brought up the rear, watching for strays. Turkeys had a tendency to just wander off and join a different flock if they passed another turkey farm. I mean, can you blame them? Maybe they had an idea of where they were headed and what they were headed for. Workers also watched for predators, which might view the flock as an easy meal, and even for people who might claim a stray turkey as their own. I mean, to be fair, I would 100% adopt a stray turkey. He's a rescue, I'd tell everyone. And then there was the support crew. The whole operation relied on other folks driving a supply wagon, carrying food and tents, and also enough corn to help the birds maintain their weight during the trip. Although, since these drives happened in the fall, there was also leftover grain in the fields along the way for the birds to eat. The whole gaggle would hit the road as early as possible every morning and walk until dusk, because, like chickens, turkeys roost at night. As dark approached, one of the lead birds would fly up into a tree, and that was it. The day was over. The other birds would immediately find their own places to roost and nod off. Sometimes drovers would carry lanterns after dark to try and convince the flock to go just a little bit farther. And sometimes, when crossing one of the many covered bridges that dotted the New England landscape at the time, the turkeys would think that the darkness of the bridge must mean that night had suddenly fallen and decide it was time to sleep, forcing the drovers to carry them through in order to keep moving. In this manner, the whole group would typically cover about 10 to 12 miles a day, meaning a 300-mile trip to Boston could take well over 3 weeks. Since turkeys aren't exactly suited to long walks, it was a common practice to cover their feet in tar as a way to protect them. Now, typically about 10% of the flock was lost along the way to a combination of predators, disease, and straying. Sometimes farmers would augment their flock by buying more birds from farms they passed on the route. When they arrived in the city, the farmers fattened up their birds just before selling them. Now, sales were not guaranteed, but Thanksgiving had been celebrated since 1789, when George Washington declared November 26th a national day of Thanksgiving. And as such, Bostonians were looking for something special for their holiday feasts, so sales did tend to be brisk. After selling their flocks, the farmers returned home either with cash in hand or with goods that were unavailable in rural New England. Okay, so the second thing I learned about this week is also a type of drive, a rabbit drive. Now, on the last Dirt Dispatch episode, I talked about hearing stories from people being one of my favorite things about my in person programs. And this last week, during a program about lagomorphs, rabbits, hares, and pikas, a gentleman talked about participating in a rabbit drive back in the 1950s. I felt like I had heard about rabbit drives. It tickled something in the back of my brain, but I didn't really know much about it, so of course I did some research. Now, rabbit drives are not like turkey or cattle drives. These were not domestic animals being hopped to market. A rabbit drive was, though, a mass roundup and slaughter of rabbits. Well, technically hares, since it was generally black-tailed jackrabbits that were the target of these drives. So there's two basic things you need to know about black-tailed jackrabbits for the purposes of this discussion. First, while they live in a variety of habitats, they really thrive in dry environments. And second, their populations tend to cycle every 7 to 11 years. And when it's at its peak, the population density of black-tailed jackrabbits in particular areas can be incredibly high. Now, rabbit drives were practiced by indigenous people long before European colonization. The Paiute Shoshone people of Nevada were known to engage in rabbit drives as a form of subsistence hunting. Basically, it worked like this. Each person took a position about 50 feet from the person next to them, forming a semicircle, usually facing a lake or a river. By closing in gradually, the semicircle becomes smaller and smaller, driving the rabbits ahead of them and making it difficult for them to escape. Eventually, the mass of rabbits are trapped between a solid line of people and a body of water, making them easy prey for arrows and ordinary sticks. After colonization, starting in the mid 1800s, rabbit drives were organized by settlers, but for very different reasons. Farmers were afraid that the rabbits would devastate their crops. The first secretaries of agriculture fueled that fear by comparing the American West to Australia, where rabbits had been introduced and then, done what rabbits do and become a devastating invasive species. In the American West, however, they were a native species, which generally means that there are native predators or diseases that limit their population to a certain extent. But rabbits were seen as pests that needed to be eliminated, and so rabbit drives were organized. Now, many of these early drives, particularly in Colorado and California, had a festival atmosphere to them. The largest ones were extensively advertised in advance, and the railroads even had special excursions to the location. People dressed up. There were concessions and balloons and gambling. An article published in 1901 in the Kansas City Gazette about the California rabbit drives describes, quote, great crowds of 10,000 to 20,000 people assembled to see the fun. The rabbits cry shrilly like a baby in pain when being killed. The fur flies in an obscuring cloud. Sometimes the young rabbit hands hit one another in the excitement and dust of the slaughter, and the drive ends up in a free fight to the intense amusement of the spectators, unquote. They had a different definition of fun than what I do. Now, rabbit drives were not limited to California and Colorado. Many other places put on their own rabbit drives. But when the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl hit, the revelry drained out of these events, and they once more became at least perceived as a matter of survival. Now remember that black-tailed jackrabbits thrive in dry conditions, and the Dust Bowl, a period of severe drought that hit the Great Plains in the mid to late 1930s, didn't faze the jackrabbits one bit. In Kansas in 1935, there were estimated to be 8 million jackrabbits in 30 western Kansas counties. Now, I'm not going to get into a lot of detail about the human contributions to that whole situation. The lack of rainfall was out of their control, but the farming practices of the time and the continuing persecution of predators like coyotes contributed to both the Dust Bowl conditions and the number of jackrabbits. But with crops and livestock already failing thanks to the drought, the overabundance of jackrabbits at least made for a convenient scapegoat. People needed something to blame for the crops failing and losing what little they had. Realistically, the jackrabbits were probably eating the brushy, weedy plants and not really having much of an impact on the farmers. The crops were failing anyway and would have failed in the absence of rabbits. But rabbit drives provided both a source of food and, at least initially, income. Some counties were paying between 1 and 4 cents per rabbit while they could still afford it. And many people were afraid of catching rabbit fever, which is a bacterial infection that spread through ticks and flies feeding on infected animals, one of the primary hosts being rabbits. So many of the slaughtered rabbits were ground into fertilizer and feed for chickens and hogs. In the mid 1950s, another drought facilitated an abundance of jackrabbits, and again, that's the time period when the gentleman I spoke to had participated in a rabbit drive near Greeley, Colorado. And he also stated that they took the rabbits to the ice house where they were ground into pig feed. The last widely publicized jackrabbit drives were organized as recently as 1981 in Mud Lake, Idaho. Animal rights groups, including the Idaho Humane Society and the Fund for Animals, sued the drive organizers on the grounds of animal cruelty, but the Idaho Supreme Court ultimately sided with the farmers. Then, in 1983, the region's jackrabbit population crashed. Now, there hasn't been another eruption, or what people sometimes call a plague of jackrabbits, for many years, which is actually a little bit puzzling. The American West has been experiencing drought conditions for some time now, and given their history, we should be knee-deep in jackrabbits. But researchers aren't sure why we're not, and different studies point to different culprits. The answer probably lies in a combination of things: disease, parasites, increasing populations of native predators, and changes in habitat. It's also possible that the absence of black-tailed jackrabbit population spikes reflects an overall species decline. Maybe there just aren't enough of them to reach noticeable levels anymore. But at least for now, they're considered to be a species of least concern, meaning that they're not currently at risk of extinction. They're widespread, abundant, and their population is estimated overall to be stable. We'll just have to see what the future holds, I guess. And on that note, we'll wrap up this episode. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to support the podcast, here's some ways you can do that. Become a patron. Subscriptions start at just $5 a month, and with 3 paid months, you get some pretty cool Dispatches from the Forest merch. You can find all the details at patreon.com/dispatchesfromtheforest. You can donate using PayPal or Venmo with my email address, dispatchesfromtheforest@gmail.com. You can also use that email address to email me with a question, a comment, or a request for a future episode. You can also donate using the Cash App and the hashtag #ForestNerd. If writing checks is how you roll and you want to send me a check, just shoot me a message and I'll happily provide my mailing address. Check out the merch store at cafepress.com/shop/dispatchesfromtheforest, then click on products and find something you like. Finally, follow Dispatches from the Forest on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube. I'm your host, Tim the Nature Nerd O'Hara, reminding you to go outside and get dirty. Dispatches from the Forest recognizes that the lands where we live, work, and recreate are the traditional homelands of the Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho people. We understand that this land holds immense significance for the original stewards, native nations, and peoples of this region. Dirt Dispatches is a production of Dispatches from the Forest and may not be used or rebroadcast whole or in part without express written permission.